The snow hadn't come yet, but the cold had. It came the way it always did in the Bitterroot Valley, not with drama, but with a kind of slow, pressing weight, the kind that settled into log walls at night, and was still there in the morning, sitting on your chest before you opened your eyes. From the trail, the Holst homestead looked like every other claim staked along that stretch of the valley. A single-room log cabin, a small lean-to for the mule, a woodpile stacked against the eastern wall. Nothing unusual, nothing worth stopping for. But behind the cabin, carved into the hillside where the slope rose sharply toward the tree line, there was a shallow cave, maybe 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide. And in the weeks before the first real snowfall, a woman was quietly making it into something that would keep her family alive when almost nothing else could. Nobody paid attention. Nobody thought they needed to. That was exactly what she was counting on. If you ever looked at an old structure and wondered how people survived without the things we take for granted today, stay with this video. Subscribe and hit the bell. Because every week we go inside the places history forgot and pull out the ideas that actually worked. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. You might be closer to the story than you think. Clara Holst was 34 years old in the autumn of 1881, and she had not planned to be homesteading alone. Her husband, Edvard, had died of a chest fever 18 months earlier, not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly and with full awareness of what he was leaving behind. 3 children, a half-finished claim, and a woodpile that wouldn't last a Montana winter without someone coming to refill it every 2 weeks. Clara had grown up in Telemark, Norway, the daughter of a shepherd who wintered his flock in the hills above the valley floor. She knew cold the way some people know a difficult neighbor, not fondly, but intimately. She knew what it did to wood, to animals, to people who underestimated it. What she didn't have was enough credit at the Stevensville trading post to buy the firewood she'd need. What she did have was time, before the ground froze and the hillside behind her cabin, and a mind shaped by a child had spent watching her father coax warm from the least hospitable terrain in southern Norway. The problem wasn't dramatic. It never is at first. The plank floor of the cabin let cold air rise in the ground beneath it, a constant, invisible drain. The single hearth drew reasonably well, but it faced the longest wall, which meant most of the radiant heat moved laterally and went straight out to the chinking between the logs before the stones could absorb much of it. The firewood stacked outside was already absorbing moisture from the autumn rains. Green or wetwood burns cooler and faster. You get less heat for the same volume. And you go through your supply at a rate that by February starts to feel like bleeding out. Clara looked at the hillside. She looked at the cave her husband had dug the previous spring, intending to use it as a root cellar. She looked at her 3 children, ages 5, 8, and 11, and she started moving. What Clara built was not impressive to look at. That was the point. She didn't erect anything. She didn't purchase materials she didn't have. She worked with what the land offered and what she already owned, and she made a series of small changes that, taken individually, each looked like nothing at all. The first thing she did was move the firewood. All of it, every split log, and every branch she cut through October came off the outside wall and went into the cave. She stacked it against the back wall and the sides, leaving a narrow central aisle. The cave's earth walls and stone ceiling held a relatively stable temperature, hovering around 34 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius, even in deep winter, cold enough to prevent rot, but far warmer than the open air outside. More importantly, the cave was dry. The firewood, once inside, stopped absorbing moisture. Dry hardwood burns at roughly 15 to 20% greater efficiency than would at 25% moisture content or above. Over season, that difference is not trivial. The second thing she did was cut a low connecting passage, about 2 feet high and 3 feet wide, through the back wall of the cabin into the cave. She lined this tunnel with flat river stones she'd hauled from the creek bed in a wooden sledge, working in the mornings while the children were doing their lessons. The tunnel served 2 purposes. It gave her direct access to the wood supply without stepping outside in a blizzard, and it created a transitional buffer zone between the cave's cold air and the cabin's warm air, a dead air space. Similar in principle to the double wall construction used in Norwegian loft buildings, where trapped air acts as insulation. The third modification was the simplest. She hung 2 layers of wool fleece. Pinned to a wooden frame she built from scrap lumber across the mouth of the cave, wool is a poor conductor of heat. Air pockets trapped in its fibers resist thermal transfer far better than wood or canvas. The double-layer curtain created an insulating barrier at the cave's entrance that slowed cold infiltration significantly, while still allowing her to pass through easily. She filled the gaps in the cabin's floor planks with a mixture of ash and clay she packed by hand. Ash, being a fine particulate with low thermal conductivity, has been used as a floor insulator in Scandinavian and Eastern European folk construction for centuries. It doesn't look like engineering. It is. None of this was visible from the trail. From the outside, the Holst cabin looked exactly as it always had, modest, quiet, nothing worth stopping for. The criticism, when it came, wasn't angry. That would have implied someone thought it mattered. A carpenter named Aldous Fenn passed through the valley in late October, doing repair work on 2 of the larger homesteads to the north. He stopped at Clara's well for water and noticed a low tunnel entrance at the base of the cabin's rear wall, the wool curtain hanging across the hillside opening, the absence of the woodpile where it was supposed to be. He stood there a moment, working it out. "Looks like a badger den," he said. Not meanly, almost admiringly, the way you might note something peculiar about an animal's behavior. He refilled his canteen and moved on. A woman named Ruth Callahan, who ran the nearest established homestead about 3 miles down the valley with her husband and 4 sons, came by in early November to drop off a jar of preserved beets, a customary kindness before the snows closed the trails. She saw the wool hanging at the cave mouth and asked about it. Clara explained. Ruth nodded slowly in the way people nod when they've already decided not to change their mind. "That's a lot of good fleece to be hanging in the dirt," she said. "Wool like that would keep a child warm all winter." "It will keep 3 of them warm all winter," Clara said. Ruth smiled politely and left. There was no argument, no warning, no intervention from a local authority figure who felt his expertise was being undermined. The people around Clara Holst simply didn't consider what she was doing significant enough to oppose. It was an odd arrangement, something a widow with too much time had put together. It would probably be fine. It would probably also make no difference. Nobody tracked what she was doing. Nobody compared notes. The valley went about its preparation for winter, stacking wood outside in the usual way, banking hearths in the usual way, and waiting for the cold that everyone knew was coming. December 14th, 1881. The storm came in from the northwest. Local accounts from the Stevensville area described that system as one of the harder early winter events of that decade. Not a record breaker by the standards of the northern Rockies, but sustained and serious. Temperatures in the Bitterroot Valley dropped to approximately minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius at their lowest point. Wind drove snow horizontally for the better part of 3 days. Visibility on the open trail fell to near zero by the afternoon of the first day. The valley shut down. Firewood stacked outside, the standard practice, collected snow and moisture between the splits. Wet wood placed on a fire produces steam before combustion, drawing heat out of the firebox rather than into it, lowering burn temperature and increasing smoke. Families who planned on a 2-week supply found themselves burning through it in 10 days, as they compensated by feeding the fire more frequently to maintain any warmth at all. Chimneys drew poorly in the sustained wind. The pressure differential that creates proper draft, pulling combustion gases up and out, reversed intermittently when gusts hit the flue opening at the wrong angle, sending smoke back into the room. Families banked their fires lower to reduce smoke, which reduced heat, which meant more blankets, less sleep, children kept from the floor. Clara fed a small fire, a fire about a third the size by volume of what her neighbors were burning, and she waited. The firewood in the cave was dry. She brought in 2 or 3 logs at a time to the tunnel, which meant she never opened an exterior door during the storm. The cave's earth mass, at a stable subsurface temperature, meant the wood never dropped below freezing. It was ready to burn cleanly within minutes of being placed in the firebox. The wool curtain at the cave mouth and the stone-lined tunnel acted as a thermal lock. Cold air entering the cave slowed, warmed slightly against the stone, and arrived at the cabin wall at a temperature closer to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 2 degrees Celsius, rather than the minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius outside air. The ash-packed floor seems no longer bled cold upward through the planks. The fire didn't need to work as hard. So it didn't. Stay with me. Because in the next chapter, a neighbor came to check on Clara, expecting to find her struggling. What he measured inside that cabin changed how people in that valley thought about winter for a generation. On the second day of the storm, a man named Peter Callahan, Ruth's eldest son, 19 years old, pushed through the drifts to the Holst homestead on snowshoes to check on the widow and her children. He expected to find them huddled in coats around a dying fire. What he found was the children doing lessons at the table. Clara was at the hearth, not feeding it, just watching it. The fire was low and steady, the kind of fire you maintain when you're not trying to compensate for anything. Peter Callahan was a practical young man. Oral accounts suggest he'd brought along a thermometer, the kind used to monitor livestock conditions in the cold, more from habit than any specific intention. He held it in the center of the room. The reading, as recorded in a letter Ruth Callahan wrote to her sister Missouri in the spring of 1882, was 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius. His family's cabin, he later reported, had dropped to 31 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 0.5 degrees Celsius on the floor level during the second night of the storm. They had burned through nearly their entire 2-week firewood reserve in those 3 days. Clara had burned, by her own count, roughly half what an equivalent household in the valley had consumed during the same period. Her remaining wood supply, still stacked in the dry cave, was sufficient for another 6 to 8 weeks of winter at her current burn rate. The difference wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was the accumulation of small decisions: dry fuel, no heat loss through the door during refueling, a stone-lined tunnel slowing infiltration, a dead air layer at the cave mouth, ash-sealed floor planks eliminating ground-level cold drafts, and a hearth that only needed to maintain a room that was already insulated rather than recover heat that kept escaping. Thermal mass, the ability of dense materials like stone and packed earth to absorb, store, and slowly release heat, was doing a significant portion of the work. The cave's earth walls had taken weeks to equilibrate to a stable underground temperature, and they were giving that stored energy back, slowly and continuously, to the stone tunnel and the cabin's shared rear wall. Peter sat down at Clara's table. The children offered him tea. He accepted. He had a lot to think about. The storm ended on the morning of December 17th. The valley dug itself out slowly. Livestock were checked. Trails were opened. Neighbors compared notes. The way people do after a shared ordeal, measuring their experience against each other's to understand what had just happened. Peter Callahan talked. Quietly, the way news travels in small communities, not as an announcement, but as a detail dropped in passing, repeated, and gradually becoming a thing everyone knew. Ruth Callahan came back to the Holst homestead in February. She asked Clara, specifically, to walk her to the cave, the tunnel, the wool curtain, the floor seams. She brought a notebook. By early spring of 1882, 3 families in the valley had made variations on Clara's arrangement. None of them built it exactly as she had. They adapted to their own terrain and materials. One family built a cover which shed directly against the cabin's back wall, eliminating the need for a cave, but achieving a similar buffer effect. Another family adopted the ashen clay floor ceiling, without touching their firewood storage at all, and reported noticeably less floor-level cold the following winter. A third family ran a stone-lined alcove from their existing root cellar into the rear of their main room. Nobody called it an invention. Nobody wrote Clara Holst's name in a record book or filed a report with a land office. They just called it the Holst way, and within 2 winters, something like it had shown up in some form, in some partial adaptation, in at least a dozen homesteads along that stretch of the valley. The woman who'd been quietly building a badger den, while everyone smiled politely had, without intending to, change how a community thought about winter. Clara Holst didn't have a vocabulary for what she'd done. She couldn't have told you about thermal mass, or infiltration rates, or the R value of a double-layer wool barrier. She didn't know the term dead air insulation, or the physics of pressure differentials in chimney draft. She hadn't studied building science. She had studied Norwegian winters, and her father's methods, and the particular way that coal behaved in the Bitterroot Valley, and she had applied what she knew to what she had, that is, engineering. It doesn't always wear the right clothes. What she understood, practically, intuitively from memory, was that heat is not just produced, it's managed. That the battle against cold is not won at the fire, but at the walls, the floor, the door, the wood supply, the 10 small places where warmth leaks out before it can do any work. The fire burning half as large in a well-managed space will outperform a roaring fire in a leaking one every single time. She understood that the materials available to her, earth, stone, ash, wool, the stable temperature of the ground itself, were not primitive substitutes for better technology. They were the technology, shaped over centuries of people in cold places figuring out what actually worked. Modern building science has formal names for all of it: vapor barriers, thermal bridging, ground source temperature stability, buffer zones. The principles Clara applied in the Bitterroot Valley in the autumn of 1881 are the same principles behind some of the most energy-efficient structures built today. The difference is that she didn't have the luxury of ignoring them, and the blizzard, when it came, confirmed what she already knew. If this story changed how you think about old solutions and simple materials, leave a comment below. We want to know, where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Every story in this series comes from places where survival wasn't a concept. It was Tuesday. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.